significant consideration. So it still is. If you get it wrong, if you completely misunderstand the environment, then clearly you can set the organisation up quite badly. If, however, you've done a reasonable job, understanding the environment is the start of the game, but it's not the completion. And there are other more significant things that we'll look at, which have are more contemporary strategic theory, which allow you to have more of an impact on the organisation. So that's the context. As I said, I think it's a pretty straightforward topic, so we'll move through it fairly quickly. So we're still in the strategic position, and as I indicated, we have a number of different dimensions which really describe how the organisation competes, one of which is how it relates to the environment, and that's what we're dealing with today, and that reflects chapters 2 and 3, the macro environment and the micro environment, essentially, of the organisation. Then we're going to talk about strategic capability, which is what the organisation actually has, or that it has built, what it possesses, that actually makes it more competitive in that environment. And as I intimated last week, it's not about the fact that it's got a big building or lots of people or it owns some machines. Those are what are required to operate at the scale at which it functions. But the competitive features are about special things that the organisation has built, like a particularly capable or innovative culture, like some proprietary designs or a special system that they have that no one else has. It's not easy to replicate. And so those are the strategic capabilities which make the products of the organisation or the services stand out, and that's what gives them the competitive advantage. Then we've got the ambition of the organisation, which is its strategic purpose. Why is it there, and what should it be doing in the future? And this is a critical thing. Most organisations are so engaged with day-to-day operations, they sort of forget about what it's all really about. And they can tell you what they're doing, but not how it fits in or why they're doing that. So they might say, oh, well, you know, we supply customers, we get them fresh produce, and we do this and we do that, and we have the highest technology, etc., etc. And it's all very much a description of the operations without saying, but what is the meaning of this activity? Why are there 1,000, 10,000 people engaged in this? Why are you consuming 10 gigawatts of power per year to do this? Why are you turning over $5 billion worth of revenue in this? What is this all about? And unless you can answer that question, you're not really making good use of all of that massive amount of infrastructure, or small amount of infrastructure if it's a small business. But nevertheless, strategic purpose is something that organisations don't engage in as much as they might. And then we've got culture and strategy, and that's really getting down a little bit more to the implementation side of things, and that's chapter 6. So at the moment we're just looking at the environment, chapters 2 and 3, and as I said, we'll move through that fairly quickly. So let's start with the macro environment. What are we trying to achieve here? This PESTEL analysis is simply an acronym for the 5 or 6 major dimensions of the environment that it's important to look at. They won't always all be significant. Some of them might be much more significant than others, but you always need to go through this checklist and say what's going on in each of these areas. And that will determine the major drivers of change, the winds that are coming through that make the world different and that you have to be ready for. We're going to look briefly at scenario analysis, which is a prediction of what could happen based on where we are. What happens if? What happens if? And given that, where would our organisation be positioned? Because you can guarantee change is going to happen. So there's no point in ignoring it, but rather knowing that it's going to happen, if you can predict the sorts of changes that might occur and look at what happens to your organisation or work out what would happen to your organisation if that did occur, it gives you an idea of what you need to do. If, for example, in every scenario you can think of, your competitors take away more market share because your organisation is inflexible, then it's giving you a pretty clear message that pretty much no matter what goes on, you're going to start to lose market share because you're in flexibility. So time now, before it happens, to start looking at how you can make the organisation a more flexible organisation through structure and culture and a range of other factors. So scenarios are good for identifying the sorts of things that you know you're going to have to do before you actually need to have them in place. And you remember we talked about how long it takes to implement strategies. So you need years of warning to make a change. If you want to make the organisation more flexible, then it's going to take years to do that. Porter's 5 forces is the industry level or the micro level analysis, which again is just basically a checklist. It's slightly more sophisticated than the Pestel one, which is very static, in the sense that we can consider the balance between the forces, because a number of the forces, Porter's 5 forces, are balancing forces. And the organisation ends up being in the balance point between the two. But we are in a position to manipulate some of the pressure of some of these forces by exposing the organisation to that force to a greater or lesser extent, and that can move the balance point. So we've got a little bit of room there to influence what we experience at the industry level, whereas at the Pestel level, we're pretty much stuck with that. There's not much you can do about things like economy, technology, natural environment, and so forth. Then we're going to look briefly at strategic groups and market segments. Strategic groups, I think, are particularly interesting because we tend to think of most industries as just a collection of organisations doing their thing. But when you choose some appropriate measures like organisational size and quality of product or service, and you start to position all of these organisations, you'll see that they form into clusters. That is, there is natural, attractive combinations of, in this instance, size and quality that are successful in the industry. And so you'll see organisations will cluster. Maybe one will be large but low quality, and another one might be small and high quality. And then you can look at the behaviour of the organisations in that cluster, how successful they are, how much they turn over, and you can say, well, what's a really good way to compete in this industry on the basis of the distribution? So doing strategic group maps often gives you a really good insights as to what are the most successful business arrangements or setups that work in the industry. Blue oceans we'll touch on. Blue oceans came out a few years ago. It's self-evident, but it was a surprise at the time because no one realised how significant they were. And basically, the two researchers had a look at the most successful companies over the last 100 years and found that over 60% of their total revenue was a result of doing something completely different. That is, they made less than 40% of their revenue by doing what they normally did, and over 60% of their revenue was basically by coming up with a new market that no one had before. Not so left field, basically what they did, but just coming up with a completely new idea as to how to do it. And they created what they called these blue oceans, where there was basically no competition. It was just them out there, free sailing. Everyone loved the idea. Their profit margins were high. The money they spent on competition was low, and they made a large portion of their profit out of these areas. And of course, once you create a blue ocean, everyone else comes in, starts sailing around in there too, competition increases, and then it turns into what they call the red ocean, which is highly competitive, high cost, low profit margin. So everyone knows that. It's pretty intuitive, right? You start up a new market, but no one realised what proportion of overall profit comes from the blue oceans, and that was their big message. And of course, they wrote a whole book about it, which talked about how to identify it and so forth and so on. So blue oceans, we'll touch on those. Interesting, intuitive, and surprisingly significant. And we'll use that to recognise threats and opportunities in the marketplace. I want to play down the whole threats and opportunities thing as part of that SWOT perspective that we talked about last week, which is a very static, very inward-looking perspective. It's the creativity and the disruption and so forth in the current environment that tends to provide the opportunities for organisations, rather than just saying, oh, here's a threat, here's an opportunity, we'll protect ourselves against the threat and go after the opportunity. That's a very static and two-dimensional way of looking at things, and it doesn't lead to a high level of competitive advantage. All right, so we've got the macro environment, then we've got the micro environment or the industry. In our industry, in our particular area, we've got some competitors. The industry will have other people who don't compete with us. They're a different scale or a different segment of the industry. And then, of course, our market. And within all of that group lies our organisation. So, here's a combined picture of the macro and micro environment. That's everything you need to know. You're at the centre, around the organisation in the centre. I hope, is that legible? Well, anyway, you've got your own version of that. You've got suppliers, you've got alternative products that your customers can buy, you've got people who buy from you, you've got new companies coming in, and you've got existing companies competing with you. And they will shape what you can and can't do. They will shape what gives you more success. They will shape the availability of resources, staff, technology, and all sorts of things. Then wrapped around that is the larger world factor, which is comprised of the economic conditions. Are things improving, or economically are they getting worse? We find that economic conditions normally run about a 10-year cycle. So you get sort of things aren't too good, and you're being quite careful about money, and sales are probably on the decline. You're too close to that microphone. Sales are on the decline, and you're quite cautious. And then things start to improve, pick up, consumer sentiment goes up, and so things start to do quite well, and you grow and you make a bit of money, and you have maybe 5 years at that. And then you see that sort of levelling off, and then you find yourself in a situation where you need to be more and more careful, profit margins are eroded, sales are going down, and that's the economic cycle. And it's pretty much a 10-year cycle, so that's one of the overlays that just runs over the top of your business success. Same with legislation and regulations. Government will decide, okay, all organisations need to have, for example, a positive environmental impact. So in other words, if you want to stay in business in this country, you now need to improve the environment rather than consume the environment. So that's costs and activity for you. Then there's things to do with population demographics. Where are people living? They're all moving from the country into the city. People are moving into increasingly high intensity living environments, so those are some of the characteristics. So if you happen to sell lawnmowers, for example, you will have found that the sale for lawnmowers continuously decreases, or perhaps now people are buying small lawnmowers. They used to buy big ones, now they buy small ones because everyone's backyard is getting smaller or disappearing. Then there's various societal values, what's being valued by society. Technology is obviously something that's being valued at the moment. If there is a major environmental event, then environmental impact will become something that's valued, and so forth and so on. And technology coming through, creating opportunities for new products, new processes, and different sorts of demands. So we've got that as the macro environment, which is an overriding influence on all types of organisations, from government through to private industry. And then we've got the industry level conditions, or the micro environment as I like to think of it. So the macro environment, we have this PESTEL framework. It's a checklist. They're pretty much as you see them. There's nothing special. You just need to identify what are the political factors. Now, the one mistake I see with this is not completely addressing what each of those labels means. So one mistake that people make, for example, is that they talk about the politics in the company. This is the macro environment, so it helps to talk about the country, possibly even the world. So it could be the global political environment, it could be the global economic environment, certainly, global social factors. A lot of these things are global, or at least at the country level. There may be some local variations, particularly at the political and social level. You know, for example, if your organisation is located in a remote country town, then there's probably going to be a number of local political and social factors that apply, but technology is probably completely transferable. But clearly in some countries technology is at a different level than others, so that would be another dimension. So think big, don't think internal with these, that's the number one thing. And think about what economic forces, technological forces, legal forces actually mean, and make sure that you're really capturing everything that goes under that banner. Fairly self-evident really, but you do need to think a little bit about these and be a little clever and a little investigatory to make sure you cover these properly. And as I said, using the label but not really putting much that relates to that underneath is probably one of the major failures I see in terms of macro-environmental analysis. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. So political factors, we've talked about those already. What does the governing bodies, what constraints do they apply? How transparent are they? How predictable are they? How quick are they to change? How interventionist are they? How much do they get involved? How standoff are they? How approachable? How flexible? All that sort of thing. So the gap layer of the EU, we could now replace that with contraction of the EU. That seems to be, economic union seems to be in trouble. It might collapse. That's a really big deal. That really changes the arrangements. And as a result of a politico-economic consequence, they might even stop using a shared currency, and that will have some effects as well. If you happen to be in the UK, of course, they're planning to exit from the EU, and so the political impact upon them will be quite significant, and that's going to affect all sorts of opportunities. And we're already seeing companies in the UK who are used to trading with Europe because it was built in as part of the Union, are now saying, right, okay, well, we now need to be trading with other countries. So they're looking at Australia, they're looking at China in a way that they hadn't looked at before. Economic factors, right, I gave you the example of business and economic cycles, interest rates, all these sorts of factors there. There's a whole list of things that you can consider, nothing too difficult, I don't think. The social factors, you have to be a little bit more careful and clever about that. Because we're surrounded by social factors. Some examples there: fashion, culture, behaviours, trends, all interaction between social media and technology and social behaviours and so forth. So a lot going on. Dig through that big pile of social things and work out which are the ones that are relevant to your organisation. So some of them are just going to blow past and they really just don't mean anything. So for a lot of organisations, social media is actually not that significant. It's a little bit around the PR and so forth, but it doesn't really drive strategy. And for other organisations, they're right in the middle of it. An NGO or a charity might find themselves right in the middle of social media, and that's a key influence on them. Technological factors, we all know what sort of impact that has on product, process and expectations. Ecological factors, what's going on in the world. And we've got two dimensions. The natural environment dimension has been on the radar now forever, really, since the 70s. It's well established. We have still the full spectrum of companies ranging from those that actually improve the environment. They spend money on improving the environment. Maybe they buy a big block of land for their factory that's been devastated in the past through pollution, and they restore it and have an environmentally friendly factory. So they have a positive impact. Even that's been around since the 90s. But the social impact, the social environmental impact is still emergent, even though we've been talking about it for a while. We don't do a very good job. So we still have supply chains that result in inequity, child labour, all those sorts of things, routinely as part of organisational behaviours. We still really haven't grasped that one. That one's, I think, just going to continue to emerge as it's not going away. And I think the social issues around social sustainability will become a larger and larger factor. If you look at the parallel with quality management, which really appeared about the same time as the natural environment issues, but moved up much faster because there was a direct connection. It was quite internal. So you improve the quality of your processes and people are happy and they buy more. It was a relatively simple formula. And so it took off more quickly than natural environmental impact did. And so for a while it was a big issue and it was viewed very separately, brought into the organisation but given special attention. And then after about 15 years, everyone started to say, oh, quality's dead. But it hadn't really died. What it had just done was become part of routine daily operations, and it was just added to the manager's checklist along with everything else, staff satisfaction, performance metrics, and a whole range of other things. It had just been completely absorbed as a natural thing. And now, when there's a quality issue, we're really quite surprised, aren't we? If you went back to the 1970s when something failed, it was just normal. But now, you know, for example, if I forgot to turn up or something like that, that would be really quite surprising. You think, why hasn't Stuart turned up? What's happened? This is not something that would normally go on. So the whole quality assurance checking, meeting customer needs has become very integral to normal management behaviours. And we're starting to see the same thing with the natural environment, I think. But the social sustainability side of things is still quite emergent, and it's yet to even become a major topic of attention. And it's a long way, I think, from becoming fully absorbed as just a normal management activity. But that's the direction we're moving in. Legal factors, regulation. Regulation's an interesting one, I think, because it's driving a lot of internationalisation. Because it's quite easy to internationalise technology and a whole range of other things, and government policy have made it quite straightforward to just say, right, we're going to have some operations here because it's a good place to run our business. People are saying, well, I don't like the regulations here. The government's too interventionist, they change their policies too much, their policies don't favour our industry. We're going to go to an environment where we like the regulation better. So in the past legal factors, we've just said, well, you know, that's the deal. They do tend to be fairly country specific, region specific, but interestingly, with the ease of internationalising even small businesses, organisations are saying that's a more attractive legal environment for us. We like the way the regulations work. They're tighter, they're looser, they're whatever. So we're going to go over there. So there's an interesting kickback from the legal factors where I think in more recent times, and certainly much more recent than this framework, organisations are responding to legal factors by saying, let's go where the legal process suits our organisation, or the regulatory framework suits our organisation better than we perhaps find ourselves at the moment. So that's an interesting one, interesting consequence of that one. Okay, so what do we do? Key drivers of change. Out of all of these categories, you're going to find some single items, and those single items are the exciting things that we need to remember. Technology is sweeping through this industry, and it's knocking organisations over. Small organisations are growing rapidly, big ones are collapsing right in front of us. It's a big deal. All of the traditional ways we did things are out the window. 4 or 5 years' time, nothing's going to be the same in this industry. Technology is a big wave, and it's specifically due to whatever it is. Similarly, we're finding economic conditions are just going down, spiralling down terribly, so that's going to tighten our profit margins. It's going to reduce our sales volumes, it's going to increase competition, it's going to make it harder to have economies of scale, reduce our operating costs through volume. So all of these things, and this is another big factor. So you're going to end up identifying half a dozen of these. If you've got 30, you're wrong. There won't be 30 major forces. There never are. There'll be half a dozen or so. If you can only find 1 or 2, scratch around a bit longer, there must be some more. So as a rule of thumb, between 5 and 10 is what you want. And from a practical perspective, how can you possibly respond to 30 forces? You can't. You're going to have to prioritise anyway. On the other hand, if you're only picking 1 or 2 forces, you're probably not really picking up on everything that's going on out there, so you need to expand it. So aim at half a dozen, between 5 and 10. Key factors that are at the top of your list which come out, but not the labels. Don't just say that the economy is the key factor. What it is about the economy is what you need to get down to. Okay, what else? Be informed about it. Have some facts to support your arguments. Obviously know which direction it's going in. Is it helping your organisation or making life tougher, and how? And think about how it's going to evolve in the, say, next 5 years. What's technology's coming in, it's wiping out the industry. Is this a overnight thing and then it's going to settle, do you think? Or is it likely to continue to be turbulent for the next 5 years? So if you take an example from history of a paradigm-changing example of technology, I referred to last time, which was the dot-com boom, which is sort of 16 years ago now. That came through, companies said, right, bricks and mortar factories, they're all yesterday's news, selling off the factories, setting up online companies, new online companies, all around the technology of online purchasing, because it had really just emerged as a viable medium. Fantastic, so they all followed this path. It was transformatory, it was changing, companies disappeared, companies appeared, the whole lot. And then it was all over and done with in less than 2 years. It just blew through in about 24 months and then just went away, leaving a wreck of devastation of organisations that had got the game wrong all the way along the line. So that was very transitory. It didn't keep coming, and there weren't new forms of purchasing and delivery and all sorts of things that resulted from that. In fact, that technology looks the same 18 years later that it did at the time. So it just blew through, made the change, and then the wind died away. So it can be quite dramatic and instantaneous and then leave, or it can just stay and keep bubbling along like that for a long time. Okay, so you need to identify those characteristics. There's a couple of other features. These are probably a little more technical, and I think perhaps also a little less important. But there'll be some megatrends, which are the really predictable ones. I gave the example of economic cycles. You can predict them, right? We're in the economic wind down. In about 4 years' time, we'll be at the bottom. In another 4 years' time, we'll be back pretty much where we are today, with a promising 4 years ahead of us. And you can bet money on that. And if you look at the history of the last 100 years, you'll just see this 10-year cycle going on like that. It's, for all intents and purposes, there's a few factors that influence it, such as wars and other major events, stretch it or contract it a bit, but that cycle is really predictable. Other things, ageing population and so forth. Really interesting thing I was just reading, China will have one of the most aged population in about another 20 years. We're thinking about the ageing population in Australia. China's going to be actually much worse than that. The rate of birth is not maintaining the average age at all in China, and they have a rapidly ageing workforce. So that will be a really interesting thing when you've got 1.2 billion people who are not working because they're too old. How is China going to sustain that? So some interesting mega trends that's going to be significant. You can't possibly escape the impact of that anywhere in the world. That's going to be really huge. Inflection points, suddenly something just changes. So the example of China when they entered the global markets, Brexit's decision, the UK's decision to exit the EU was an inflection point, but for people in the UK, maybe a little bit for the rest of the world, not possibly more so for Europe. And then weak signals. There's an indication, or perhaps logically it ought to be happening. Logically this is going to occur, but maybe you can't see much signs of that. So, fourth largest population in the world, anyone? What is it? Anyone? Wild guess? It's Indonesia. Fourth largest population. They have to have a significant impact, don't they? They're going to have. But there's not much evidence. We don't see their economic impact. We don't really see their political impact like we do see the US, China or Japan. We don't see that. But there's weak signals. One weak signal, simple size of the population. It's nothing for that to turn over to a massive economy, and it will be so in the future. Right on Australia's doorstep, really, really close. So we've been watching Indonesia forever, for 30 years, 40 years, waiting for something to happen. It still hasn't happened. It's a weak signal. It's something you can't ignore, but the evidence is not there. So that's examples of things you just keep an eye on, because logically, or there's some indicators of something that could happen. Scenarios. I already talked about that. Probably said all I really needed to. This was this was really taken up in the 1980s. This approach by the petrol companies, because they found, as a result of demand and supply factors, their product price and their profitability was this roller coaster ride, where not so much now in more recent times, but certainly the price of the commodity, the raw material, a barrel of crude oil, could vary by up to 100% over the course of months. So that's a really crazy environment to operate in. And so, you know, it just gave everyone headaches, apart from destroying the profitability and making planning impossible. So they said, we've got to find a way to make, to at least forecast this stuff. And so scenario planning had been around for a few years, so they really embraced it. And they use a lot of scenario planning. They still do, but certainly they got into it in a big way. And to try to work out what were the sorts of things that would happen, and what happens if this country has a change of government. It's a major source of crude oil. What happens if the new regulation around environmental impacts in the US comes through? That's a major customer, and so forth. And what happens to our organisation when that happens, and how would we be able to respond if that happened? And it's that last point, how can you respond, that's the important message. And if your answer is, oh, we couldn't, we just fall over. Well, what about in this scenario? What happens? Oh, we couldn't respond, we just fall over. And this scenario, yeah, fall over again. Then that's a pretty serious message, and it gives you an indication of what is the problem with your organisation in terms of being able to respond to likely future events. So scenarios are all about saying, this could easily happen. So what happens if this likely thing does happen? So we use our understanding of the macro environment. We say, what happens if this thing that's quite possible does actually come to fruition? What happens to us now? And it gives you a chance not so much to prepare for that specific event, but to prepare for the sorts of events that are likely to occur, to build the key capabilities that you need to deal with those. So you decide on what are you looking at. Are you looking at markets? Are you looking at a time frame? Are you looking at technology? What is in your scenario? Then you pick out from your natural environmental or macro environmental analysis, what are the key things that are going to influence that. Then for each of those things you say, okay, what happens if it goes in this direction, or it does a U-turn, heads in the other direction? Is that possible? Yeah, that's quite possible for that to occur. So what happens when that occurs? And then we have these scenarios, these stories. Okay, major market dries up, new market opens. The US, the market starts to dry up, but massive market opens in Indonesia. A number of our competitors who are well connected with Indonesia really jump on the bandwagon. What happens to us? Do we just lose our market? Are we able to start to become a big supplier to Indonesia? Do we have the supply chains necessary, or will we miss this opportunity? So that's the story. And then the impact, as I just indicated, and then think about whether the organisation has the capabilities and what it needs to keep an eye on to make sure that it's ready for those sorts of things if they occur. Here's a quick example. We've got two dimensions where the industry, the vertical dimension is the integration in the industry, and the horizontal dimension is the rate of change. And so we've got two positive outcomes, and the upper quadrants there, where there's a high level of integration in the industry, and so a low rate of change in that top left-hand quadrant there, where everything moves slowly and everyone's integrated, so they all just march along in coordination, and competition between organisations is really just a reflection of the individual capabilities, and it's gentle competition. But you might have a fast rate of change instead, in which you'll have waves of technology moving through the industry. So if it's fashion, then it'll be new materials, integration of technology into clothing, these sorts of things. And whoever's able to embrace this technology most quickly will gain a competitive advantage. If the industry and the environment, however, is very fragmented, and when I talk about the industry, I'm just not thinking about the competitors who are operating in there, but I'm talking about their suppliers and their immediate customers, the supply chains, all the support organisations. So the industry has many players in it. If it's slow, then we'll find that there'll be communities forming around specific capabilities. So you might have the avant-garde fashion industry sector and the everyday fashion industry sector, the work clothes industry sector, and so forth. And they will tend to consolidate into small groups where they support each other because they want to build up a local capability. Like a quick example of that is the wine industry in Australia started to take off in the 1980s. Lots more wineries appearing, demand was high, the industry was moving to a global leading edge. It still is. It's the #1 exporter of wine by dollar value to China, for example. But they realised as they were growing that they needed more people. They needed more highly trained people because it's quite a high-tech industry. And so they formed all sorts of clusters. They formed research institutes. They worked with a number of the universities to establish wine degrees, oncology degrees, oenology degrees, and a whole range of different support services. And they formed into clusters to drive this because they wanted to build up the capability of their industry further. So that was their response, because they were quite fragmented. That was their response to trying to the demand that was on them, and they formed clusters. So you'll see various factors will drive clusters where that's possible. However, if the environment's changing too fast, and whilst the wine industry was experiencing really good growth, it was a very predictable and linear growth. So they just said every 10 years we're 10% bigger. So it was a change, but it wasn't a turbulent change. It was a very predictable change. We'll just keep doing what we're doing and everyone's loving it, and sales just keep going up, and countries that didn't buy wine before, like Indonesia, now buys a significant amount of Australian wine, so it just goes there. That's not a big deal. Now Korea's buying our wine. That's great. It's the same direction. So although it was reasonably rapid growth, it was a very predictable thing. Whereas if your wine's selling in Indonesia one year and is selling in Korea the next year and no one's buying it the year after, that's a more turbulent type of rapid change, which is harder to deal with. In that instance, in particular, then this sort of everyone contracts back. It's still sort of communities, but in a competitive, defensive way as opposed to a collaborative way. So the example I gave before had a lot of collaboration and development, whereas where the change gets too frenetic and dramatic, then everyone draws in and tries to defend themselves against the impact of those changes. Okay, so scenario. Another example here, this is on 2 pages, so we'll just deal with the first bit. If we look at the impact of the global economy, we see, for example, it's been growing at around 3%. That may not change. If we think about, I'm looking at this left-hand green column here, about likelihood for growth, we see that business investment attitude is moderately positive. The US remains a significant market, and the economic data available suggests that modest growth is likely forecast for the future. So now let's consider the potential alternatives. If we can be a bit more optimistic, we might say you know what, we could still see an improvement in the economy yet. There's time for that. Or we could see interest rates staying down low, creating more consumer positiveness. Or we could see government saying we really have to stimulate the economy by pushing more strongly, supporting investment. And so we might say, overall, this is a possibility, this is a bit of a U-turn, and it's probably the most unlikely outcome. So let's take now a negative perspective on this and say, okay, the global economy is going to continue to slow. China's demand has dropped, or economic growth has dropped from double figures down to single figures. We're sort of in the 15%, and now it's around 7%. So that's a slowdown in significant economic slowdown. The US is experiencing a slowdown, so that's quite likely. If you look at the middle box there in the right-hand column, government stimulus, they've been doing the same thing for a long time. It's losing its effectiveness, and so the global economy, that's another reason the global economy is likely to slow down. Then there's likely to be excess capacity because of all the organisations that are geared up to supply the booming consumer product demand in China, the booming construction in China, big markets, and so forth. And there's going to be a bit of excess demand, which is going to mean that everyone's going to start price cutting, and competition is going to become high, and profit margins are going to start to drop. And probably this is more likely. And so of those two scenarios in the right-hand columns, we might say, yeah, the pessimistic one, let's work up that one a bit more. That's a likely trend that's going to happen. So if we do get this downturn, if we do get this tightening of belts, if we do get this industry excess capacity and increased competition and tighter margins, if we do see less demand from overseas market, what happens to our organisation under those conditions? And having worked out what happens, which is likely to be negative, but it could be positive, we might say, well, that's okay, we're cool because we've got flexible capacity, so we can wind our capacity down without any penalty. Or we've got some markets that are pretty much immune to these sorts of behaviours because they're really early emergent markets and they're going to buck the rest of the global trend. Or, yeah, you know, we're just going to lose sales, we're going to lose profit margin as well. What drove that? Was it flexible capacity that drove our loss of margin? Was it inability to change what we do, our supply chains, our volumes and so forth? What was it that led to our losing that? Should we think about increasing our capability in those areas so that we can adapt to these changes if they occur? And so that's the logic of scenarios. Now, as I intimated, we were going to have a presentation about now, so we'll have a brief pause and have a presentation. Thanks. So you've got your...
Yeah.
So I think there should be another slot there which you can just use, and let you drive that.
No, it's all right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark from the Faculty of Business and Law International team, and here to briefly speak about international study opportunities that are available to you guys as part of your course. So apologies in advance if you've already seen this information. So I'll just quickly go through the information that's available. So basically what we do is we organize international study programs where you actually can go and study and work overseas and get credit towards a program at Deakin. So we have 4 different types of programs, which is exchange, where you go and study in another university for 1 or 2 trimesters and get a credit towards your course. This is like if you are interested in studying an area which is not taught at Deakin, this is an option to look at. If you want to complete a particular specialization. Then we also have short-term programs, which is similar to exchange, but then the programs are short in duration, which is about 1 to 4 weeks maximum. Then we also have faculty-led study programs where you are accompanied by Deakin staff members and you travel with a group of Deakin students. And depending on the nature of the program, you travel to certain companies. You get to meet executives of those organizations. It's a good opportunity to speak to people that you wouldn't otherwise be able to speak to if you just walk into those companies. So we're talking about Fortune 500 companies, companies like Spotify, Google, IBM, PwC. So, and once again, a good opportunity to develop your networks. Then we also have work integrated learning opportunities where you go and work in companies overseas as on a consultancy project, which is in the area of marketing or management. Once again, you develop your skills in terms of writing project reports, doing presentations, which would be valuable when you go into the workforce after you complete your course. So before we go through the programs, I'll just quickly go through the benefits of actually studying overseas. Then the first and foremost, option to travel while you complete units towards a degree and fast track your program. So as I mentioned earlier, these programs are offered during the trimester breaks at Deakin, so it doesn't interfere with the studies during T1 or T2. So it's a good opportunity to do some extra units if you want to fast track your course, or if you want to spread your study load, you can do that as well by doing units during your trimester break period. And most of these programs doesn't have exams, so once again, if you're not a fan of exams, good opportunity to look at. Then selected programs available at reduced cost. So all these programs I'm going to speak on later on is subsidized by the faculty. So there's programs ranging from $1,000. So there's a $1,000 program to Malaysia, which includes flights and accommodation for 2 weeks. You can jump on Skyscan and see how much flights to Malaysia cost, and I'm pretty sure it's costing over 1,500. So for $1,000, you can travel to Malaysia for, which includes accommodation as well. And continue traveling once you finish your program. So basically, Deakin doesn't impose any restrictions saying that you must come back to Melbourne as soon as you finish your program. You can stay back and travel for as long as you want, and Deakin provides 10 free days of travel insurance. Experience what the classroom can't offer and gain international experience. As I mentioned earlier, you get access to opportunities that you otherwise won't be able to access. And also, with increased globalization, employers are looking for people who have the knowledge of how to deal with other people from other cultures, the understanding of how businesses in other countries operate. So it's a good opportunity to get some of that on your CV. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, units can be completed within 1 to 3 weeks. So I'll quickly go through some of the programs that are on offer for trimester 2, which is the June-July break. That's applications for these programs are currently open and will close on the 18th of March. So we have the US Accounting Study Program, the United States Marketing Study Program, which are 2 study tours. And they go into Fortune 500 companies. So the accounting program obviously has an accounting focus, and the marketing program marketing focus. And also the benefit of the marketing program is you can actually complete 2 units within the trimester break. Marketing management and international marketing. With the marketing program, last year they visited companies like Spotify, Google. So once again, the program has been running, both the programs have been running for a couple of years, and the students have really enjoyed the experience. Then we also have the Malaysia Team Internship Program, the program I mentioned earlier. You'll be working on a consultancy project in the marketing or management field. Once again, it's a 2-week program, and there's a Deakin academic accompanying you as well on this program. And finally, we have the Aarhus University Summer School. Once again, you can study an elective. It's a short-term program. There's other short-term programs available as well. You can refer to our website for more information. And for those of you who are planning ahead, we have the India MBA study program offered in trimester 3, which is run in partnership with the Indian School of Business, a leading business school in India. And in this program, you can actually complete 2 units once again. So good opportunity to knock off 2 units during T3. So you'll be done with the program even before the trimester 3 starts. So if you're traveling to India, if you're traveling back home or something to look at. Finally, if you're on Instagram, you can follow us on #DeakinAbroad. You can see what students who have undertaken these programs in the past have done and see whether it's something that you would want to do. That's our website up there as well. So there's other programs other than the ones I spoke on and available on the website. So just jump on our website if you need more information on the programs I spoke, or if you want to see other programs. And then we also have the email addresses listed up there as well, bl-abroad@deakin.edu.au. Just drop us an email if you want more information. I've brought some postcards in. I've just left it on this table. If you want information on the programs, just grab one postcard. And if you want to speak to one of our team members, we're located in Building LB. That's on the other side of the campus. So just come to the Building LB reception and just say that you want to meet someone from the international team about study programs, and they will direct you to us. So that's it for me. So finally, applications for those programs close this Sunday. So just submit an application if you're keen to go on one. Any questions? Cool. Thank you for. Yes. Yes. So there is some work to be done beforehand. But then with the assessments itself, so I'm guessing so with the WIL program, there's no such reading, so you just go and work in the company on the consultancy project. But then with the marketing and accounting study programs, there's a bit of pre-reading. And assessments, there'll be some assessments due during the program, and there'll be some due after as well. So the unit content itself will be delivered during the program, but then there'll be assessments due before and after the program. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you for your time this morning. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Smriti.
Okay, so that's of some interest, I think, although for a lot of you, you're probably in your last trimester in the course, so it might be a little bit more difficult. It is, however, possible, and you didn't mention this, to do more units than the prescribed 12 units in your course. There's no limitation in actual fact, so often we find that people pick up something towards the end. They planned their course, but they say, oh, I really wish I'd done, in this instance, wanted to study to it. So you can do more units in your study. You don't have to stop at 12. So if it's really appealing to you to do that, you can just still enrol it anyway, even if you've already allocated your 12 units. Okay. All right, so we'd given an example of that, so let's move on. Now we're going to do the more detailed micro or industry environment. Okay, so a few definitions are useful to bear in mind. The industry tends to be the group of organisations that are all producing similar products or services, but they may not all call themselves the same. Right, so, for example, Google makes cars, but it's not part of the automotive industry. It's not an automotive company, but it is part of the automotive industry. Well, it doesn't actually make cars, but it could. Market is obviously the consumers, and again, we need to reflect the fact that they can be different sorts of things. So, for example, the government is a significant car purchaser, but it's probably not a member of the middle class. So it's part of the market, but a different type of customer. Sector is a segment of that particular market or that particular industry. And what we're trying to do is work out the attractiveness for our organisation of that. So again, we're still taking an external view. Don't make the mistake of talking about what the organisation does. Talk about what the environment is doing to the organisation. So Porter's framework from the mid-1980s is the framework that we still use for this. It's well developed, and at the time it was a significant part of strategic decision making. Now it still is, but we know that the actual impact on performance is less than it used to be. So we've got the 5 forces. We've got new companies coming in, taking market share. We've got other things that people can buy instead of what you produce. We've got our customers demanding features and prices and so forth. We've got suppliers who aren't going to be passive. They may be say, well, you know, there's limited supply, so you've got to pay a lot of money and you've got to wait a long time, and we can be a bit unreliable and you're stuck with it. Or we're competing really aggressively for your business, so here's a discount. We'll deliver it yesterday. However you want it done, we're super flexible. And then there's rivalry with your other competitors for market share. We draw it up like this, and I pointed out the balancing features, and I think that's probably the most interesting aspect. You can see horizontally we've got suppliers, the organisation in the middle of the competitive rivalry situation, and the buyers. So the buyers can be a strong force and the suppliers can be a weak force, in which case competition will tend and the organisation will tend to reflect the needs of the buyers. However, the suppliers may be the major force. It may just be a shortage of materials, and the buyers and the industry itself are pretty much subject to whatever the suppliers say goes. We've also got new entrants and substitutes. If there's lots and lots of substitutes, then potential new entrants may not be a very significant concern, or there might be lots of people joining this industry because the barriers to entry are low and there's not much else going on, so it's a great place to do business. As a matter of interest, given the balance of these forces, what sort of situation do you want to have in terms of the attractiveness to the industry if you're already in it? Where do you think you want the attractiveness of the industry to be in relation to these forces? What's a good outcome? Do you want it to be very unattractive? Terrible time, you're torn between the massive power of the suppliers and your customers, and you can't meet, you don't know how to satisfy both of them. What sort of situation would you want? Yes, yes. Yep, okay, so that's part of the answer. But in terms of the overall attractiveness of the industry, based on all of these forces, what would you like to see? What would be the best outcome? Super attractive, just like the best industry to be in. Incredibly unattractive, where would you like it to be? No ideas? No, you're going to take a guess? The problem with a super attractive industry is whilst you can make lots of money, everything's pretty easy, everyone's going to just pour into that, aren't they? Because like, that's the place to be. That's where everyone's making money. Let's do that. So in Australia, we had a gold rush, and they found lots and lots of gold around Victoria, and you could just come along with a spade, and then you'd have a bucket full of gold, and you'd be rich. What do you think happened to that industry, the gold mining industry? Everyone poured in, right? And they all took little tiny plots of land. They took a lease over these little blocks of land from the government. Competition was crazy. It went berserk. So that's not a good place to be in. So if it's too attractive, everyone's going to pour in there and it's going to make life miserable. If it's very unattractive, you can't make any money, so it's still going to be miserable. So you need something somewhere between the two, where it's still reasonably attractive. So if you happen to be in the industry, it's great. But there are barriers to entry. It's hard to get in. There's limited whatever, there's only a few customers, and already they've got long-term relationships with the existing suppliers. Supply is hard to get in this industry, so if you haven't got good connections with the suppliers, you can't do anything. Distribution's a problem in the industry. Some barrier, you don't want it to be perfect. You want some barriers that make it a little unattractive as a risk for new companies to invest, so that they're not coming in and changing the whole deal with rivalry. But not too unattractive that you can't make it work on a daily basis. So we're looking for the balance of forces that achieves that. Now, I'm saying looking. Why am I saying looking? Because you can move to different sectors of the industry. You can still be an automotive producer and move to different segments of the industry where there'll be a subtle difference in these forces. So you might be in a segment of the industry where suppliers are a major problem, but you might find a different segment of that same industry where actually the supply is much better. So you'll follow that. And I gave the example before of geography, where if you don't like the regulations, or you say that they're difficult, I'll move to a different country and we'll run the business there instead, because it's a global market. Who cares where we're physically located? It's the same for supply. So, for example, we used to have a big footwear industry in Australia. Lots and lots of shoes made in Australia. More than half the shoes consumed were made locally. one of the things that caused all of the shoe producers to move offshore was not the lower labour costs, but all of the material suppliers, the soles, the lace, the leather, all of those sorts of things, had all moved offshore. And what really killed the footwear industry in Australia was because shoes are a relatively expensive product, and so the labour component is actually not that great. So you try and produce a shoe in a different country. Yeah, you do get the costs down a bit by having lower labour, but not that much. And throw a bit of automation in, it even tends to be less of a difference. But they had to go overseas to get supply, because all their suppliers had gone overseas, so they had to go there, because no point in trying to make a shoe in Australia when all your major suppliers in China, and then you've got to pay for all of the raw materials at a low volume, expensive rate to be shipped to Australia. You may as well go where your suppliers are. So you can change the nature of the strength of some of these forces by choosing the sector that you operate in and get into a nice balance point where it's attractive enough, but not too attractive. So we look at the balance of these forces, and that's the key thing. We're not just interested in the forces themselves, but we are interested in the organisation and the segment of the industry that it operates in, how it fits in between these forces. And if buyers are powerful and suppliers are powerful, it's a really bad place to be, because the buyers are making great demands and the suppliers are refusing to help because they've got a lot of power too and they want to do it their way, and you're stuck in the middle. So that's really bad news. It's the same where you've got lots of new companies pouring into the industry and lots of alternative products that people can buy. You don't know what your market's like. So that's, again, an unfortunate balance point. So it's the balance between these forces rather than just the magnitude of the forces that you need to consider. But you do need to consider what they are, and you need to consider how strong they are when you do this analysis. There's a little recording, but... I think I'll leave it to you to have a listen to this, and we'll spend a little bit more time on the analysis. If we finish early enough, we'll have a look at this, but basically it's just Porter revisiting his model about 10 years later and just talking about some of the strengths and basically saying the things that I had said. So you can have a look at that, but I think on balance, since we lost 15 minutes to Mark, we might just move on. So competitive rivalry is increased when we've got lots of equivalent organisations, there's no dominant organisations, and people are trying to get to the high point where the market's mature and so everyone knows how to compete, where costs are fixed and you can't vary them too much, where you're trapped and you have to stay in the industry. So say, for example, the cement industry, relatively low margins and relatively expensive equipment to make cement. So once you set up, you don't make enough money to get out, no one really wants your equipment, and so you're trapped by virtue of the costs. You can't move into a different industry, all you can do is close down. And product differentiation is low. And again, cement's a classic example. It's a commodity product, so cement is cement produced by anyone. So then there's a lot of rivalry within the industry. Everyone's trapped. They want to make a bit more profit. Profit margins are a bit tight anyway, so they will compete vigorously. Threats of entry are low when you have to jump into the industry at a high scale. So take the example of the automotive industry again. To be a successful automotive producer, you have to be big. Or to be a successful aeroplane producer, you have to be big. It's hard to be small. So that's a high risk because a new market entrant has to throw in $10 billion to get into the industry. So that's a lot of money, and they'll say, no, maybe we'll go into an industry where we can step in for $1 billion instead. High fixed costs, another thing. Again, you've got to buy all this equipment, factories, buildings and so forth to get into the industry. Again, a big risk. Where your knowledge is critical, that can be also something that's quite expensive and difficult to purchase. So if it's a very high-tech industry, maybe a segment of the design industry or something where your success is really about high-level capabilities, or perhaps medical industry where it's a specialist medical activity such as Cochlear with their hearing aid implants. If you don't have that level of expertise, you can't compete. So again, that creates a high barriers to entry. Where supply and distribution is difficult is another one. So if anyone's ever tried to export to Japan, for example, you can't go and sell products in Japan directly. You can only sell products through distribution networks. And there's a relatively small number. So you've either got a relationship with the distribution network, in which case everything's fine, or you haven't, in which case you can't sell in Japan. So that's a barrier to entry. Can you establish a contract with the distribution network, or in which case you've got a chance, otherwise you've got zero chance to sell in Japan. Government regulations, interventionist regulations making the industry less attractive are typical barriers. Substitutes are basically something that people can do else. A classic example we have, of course, is Uber versus taxis. So Uber has devastated the taxi industry by offering an attractive alternative. It's increased rivalry, but it's also severely demolished the profitability of the industry anyway. Substitutes are not direct competitors, however. So maybe you might almost say that maybe a bike is a good example of a substitute for a taxi. But obviously there are other differences there. An example we've got here, an air ticket versus a train ticket versus a bus ticket. So the threat of substitutes is really where it's essentially more profitable, more beneficial. So an Uber is cheaper than a taxi as a rule, and you get a similar ride. They're less reliable. So if I'm doing business, a business meeting, I'm going to probably go by taxi because I think the taxi is going to be more reliable in terms of turning up and getting there when they say. And they can offer me a proper tax receipt and all of those sorts of things. Uber can as well, but maybe my business doesn't like to deal with Uber as an informal organisation. So for me, the benefit to cost is better if I catch a taxi for a business meeting. But if it's a private thing and I'm just going across the city and I just don't want to drive because it's peak hour and let someone else drive, then I'm a bit more relaxed. Then I'm going to use Uber because it's easy and convenient and cheaper. So the benefit is better from Uber. Okay, bargaining powers of buyers. I think we know what that's all about. Basically, the fewer the number of buyers, the more their ability to leverage demand. And obviously, a commercial buyer who buys in volume has even more power. Suppliers, same deal. If there's lots of suppliers, then they're going to compete vigorously and you're going to get good deals. If there's only a few suppliers and it's difficult to get product that you use as an input to your organisation, then they're going to dictate terms of suppliers, cost and features. So it's worthwhile just touching on different types of industry. They're a little less relevant to our strategic planning because we pick up these features in other perspectives. But we've either got the monopolistic industries where basically we've got really just one major organisation and they tend to drive the entire thing. So government's a classic example of that. Or Google there as in search engines, in relation to search engines. They tend to be highly regulated and so that could limit the attractiveness. Google is not regulated, and that's a challenge for a lot of industries. So what happens to other unregulated key suppliers in some countries, like social media? What happens to social media in China, for example? It's blocked. It's just blocked. So the government does want to have control. Sometimes in countries like Australia, they don't manage to do that, but in many cases with monopolistic industries, there's a high level of government control. Or you might have an oligopolistic industry in which there are a few firms that really have just divided up the industry. They've been in business maybe for 100 years, 200 years, and it's very gentle rivalry, and they're quite happy with their market share. And they just continue on there and they basically block out everybody else rather than competing between themselves because they know that they're both so large that competition between them is going to devastate their performance, that neither of them are really strong enough to come out of a competition without being fairly destructive. So we've got BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto as examples of major mining companies that just divide up the global market, and they don't worry too much about competing between themselves, but they try to keep everybody else down instead, and they accept that situation. So that's a relatively gentle form of competition. We've got competitive industries and hyper-competitive industries. Competitive industries where we've got a relatively large number of competitors compared to the market size, and it's relatively easy to scale up or down, so everyone's looking to increase their market share because they can make use of that. In some industries you might say, we don't want more market share. So for example, if you had a boutique hotel in a country town, and the building next door became available, everyone came there, it was a very expensive hotel and they had a very customised experience, but the building next door became available. Would you automatically say, yes, chance to expand the market? Or would you think twice, or would you say no? What would you do? No, you're going to make me work for this, aren't you? All right, okay, so you've got your boutique hotel with 20 rooms, and it's working really well. You're going to buy another building next door, maybe you've got 40 rooms. The question is, can you still provide that same experience with 40 guests? Does it scale up? Or just the fact that you've got 40 guests is enough to destroy the sense of a unique personalised experience, even if you've got enough staff and enough other capabilities to do that? So we don't always want to scale up in industries, but where it's an industry that you do want to scale up, it's great. There's no reason why we shouldn't make twice as much. It reduces our costs. It has no downside. Then those industries become competitive. They become hyper-competitive where there is disequilibrium introduced by external factors. Maybe the competitors have just gone crazy and there are companies in there that are just going to spend any money they like to capture more market share. Perhaps there's other factors like technology that just destroy the basis of competition and there's a constant reset, in which case then there's none of this sense of long-term position in the industry. It's up for collection at all points. All right, use of the 5 forces to identify the attractiveness of the industry, which I actually always find a bit of a second level importance, but it's always put up front. Generally, there's 2 situations. One, you're going to invest in the industry. Okay, then you're interested in the attractiveness. Or the other situation where you're already in the industry, in which case it's a bit late. It's nice that, yeah, we're in an attractive industry, but beyond that, how do you use this? More importantly, it's a strategy to influence the impact of the forces. Subtle movements to different sectors where you can reduce the power of buyers or suppliers, where rivalry is a little bit lower or more slightly less intense, where substitutes are rare or where new entrants are rare, are movements you can make in the industry to make it more attractive. And knowing, of course, which of these factors is the ones you need to, that are causing you the biggest grief, is the basis for deciding where you might want to move to. Okay. Most important to recognise the correct level. Don't be too general and identify forces that you don't really experience. So rivals are intense in this industry. However, in our sector of the industry, they're not intense. So stick with your sector of the industry. You might want to look at other sectors of the industry and say, okay, interesting, in this sector, rivalry is not intense, but in that sector it is. So we should steer clear of what would put us into that sector. You might find convergence. Several industries overlap. They do the same thing because they're all different parts of a longer supply chain, and customers will purchase at different points. Simple example, my son on his birthday next week will get a new computer. and actually it's not a new computer because it's going to be an upgrade. So he's got an existing computer, it was assembled by a company. We're going to go back and we can get some more parts put in that. So that company is in an overlap position because it sells new computers, but it also sells computer parts. And those are two different industries, but they overlap, and a lot of organisations will find themselves spanning both industries. And so they'll be exposed to the forces of both of those industries. Complementary goods are a sixth force that was introduced by Porter later on, and they enhance the product. So the classic example of that is the game console. So you have a game console, PlayStation or whatever it happens to be, and the more software that's available for that console, the more attractive that console becomes, or the cheaper the software for that console becomes. So if you can stimulate the industries that you're not in that add to the features of that particular product, then you can make it more attractive. So if you're looking for a second-hand car, one of the things you're going to think about is how much are spare parts. Now, the company who made the car, or the company who sells the second-hand cars, isn't in the spare part game. But if they can influence the spare parts industry to offer good quality available spare parts, then that makes their cars more attractive. So complementary goods can have a significant effect on the attractiveness of your products and therefore your strength in rivalry. All right, moving on. So this is another way to look at what we've just said. If you look at a company, this is a slightly dated one, it's got an iPod in there. I think it'd be iPhone would be more sensible as that central product. We've got the relationship with customers and suppliers. We've got competitors, which would be perhaps a more updated version would be Android phones. And we've got complementers, which are accessories that you can buy on your iPhone. So you think about, for example, in some stores now, they don't have a cash register. They've just got an extension for their iPads, and you can tap your card onto the adapter, and you can make the purchase. And so they don't need to have a separate FPOS terminal for financial transactions, and they don't need a cash register either. So that makes life easy for them. So that's a complementer which makes everything work a little more smoothly. So we've got the balance between all of these forces. And so the attractiveness of the iPad is a function of the demand that people have for that versus the difficulty they have of getting the parts that it comprises. The attractiveness of Android phones and the attractiveness of those complementary products. And so we can turn the five forces around to make it a what we call a value net, which is this comparison. All right, we could also take those dimensions and do essentially a web diagram there, where we can position in several dimensions the forces, and you can see what has been done there. And we've got two examples where we think the industry is now, which is in the light blue, and the darker colour, which I think you can distinguish there. Yeah, the darker colour is where we expect it to go. So you can see that we're expecting rivalry to decrease, but we're expecting the opportunities for substitutes to correspondingly increase. As rivalry goes down, a barrier disappears and more entrants will enter the market. We're expecting the power of suppliers to go down, and we're expecting the power of buyers to go down. We're also expecting, this is quite an attractive example, we're also expecting the threat of new entrants to go down. So basically, we can see that this is an industry environment that's offering more attractiveness in the future, and the one area that we really want to keep an eye on is the likelihood of substitutes, which is going to increase. On the flip side, this could also be a diagram representing an industry in its final stages of its life. This could be, for example, the iPod industry, where people are probably still buying iPods, but who's going to buy an iPod when you just use your phone for the same purpose? So this would be an industry where rivalry is decreasing because everyone's getting out of it. This could be an industry where entry threats are low because who wants to get into making iPods? Buyer power is low because there are those people who want an iPod and there's not many available, so you just got to take what you can get. You don't have to develop new versions of the iPod because, well, people are lucky that they're still in the market. Supplier power, again, there's not many people buying the components, so they're sort of saying, well, we used to do lots, so if you can still buy some, that'd be good. And the threat substitutes, on the other hand, is high because people will be using an iPhone rather than an iPod. So this could be an example of an industry in its decline phase as well. So is that attractive? Well, it can be. If everyone else leaves the industry and you're just left there and it's got another 5 years to run, you can make some good money in that 5 years because life's easy. But you've got to step out after 5 years because there's going to be no market left. So that's like a window of opportunity. If too many companies stay in the industry though and the demand continues to decrease, then they're going to suddenly become, rivalry is going to become quite intense because they've still got all of this infrastructure, this capital investment, which they have to get a return on, so they're going to try to make sales, so rivalry is going to become high just to get cash flow. So this brings us to the idea of the industry life cycle, where you've got this new emergent idea and it's great, no one's doing it, it's just constantly changing. Who knows who's going to be the dominant companies in the industry. So it's all about innovation, rapid growth in volume, and all companies are highly differentiated. Then we get into the growth phase where the organisations are preoccupied with coping with growth. We're looking at 10 to 15% growth per year. We're lucky to manage to expand to keep that. So we've got no time to think about rivalry. We're just thinking about how we keep bringing in 15% more employees. We're putting up new buildings all the time. It's chaotic. We're pretty busy. And everyone else thinks the same thing. So rivalry is quite minimal. Marketing's doing a little bit of rivalry with promotions and things, but nothing terribly serious. Okay, the industry's starting to mature now. We're in that third phase where some of the companies that didn't really get it right are starting to exit the industry because they've realised that the other companies have really got the right product, they've got the right supply chains, they've got strong basis for competition, and whilst during the growth phase there was still lots of demand, as supply starts to match demand, suddenly they're finding that everyone else is making the sales and they're not, and so they're going to start to pull out. So we'll see exits and we'll start to see organisational competencies being the main feature of competition. Then we've got maturity where basically nothing much is happening, might even be starting to decline a little bit, and its rivalry becomes quite high, margins become quite low, and it's all about control. And then decline where organisations start leaving the industry. There might be a brief period of time when a lot of organisations have left it, but there's still a moderate market and you can make some good money. You don't do anything new, you just keep on running it with what you've got while you can make the most, and then you exit as well. Strategic groups, we already talked about those. The trick is with strategic group maps, choose a couple of good dimensions for your graph, your vertical and horizontal axis, that give you clusters. If you thought, great, it's cost and size, product cost and size, and everything's just scattered over it, say, well, that wasn't a good one after all. Let's try another dimension. Let's try cost and quality. Let's try size and geographical location. Let's try cost and geographical location until you start to find some clusters. So the trick is just to keep going until you get very clear clustering formed, because that means that those two measures that you've chosen for your axes are ones that differentiate organisations. And then you can, as I said, start to look at the characteristics of each of the groups. How is each of those clusters competing? What's the key features? And how much money are they making and how big are they as a group? So some of the measures, product diversity, geographical coverage, market segments, distribution channels. resource commitment, how many branding, how much they spend on marketing, level of vertical integration, quality, technology, size. Those are all dimensions that you can consider for your axes to see if you get, and as any pair as you like, to see if you can find some clusters for me. So here's an example of pharmaceutical industry, R&D intensity. Why? Because, well, you've got to do lots of R&D for drugs. It's a pretty logical one. And international focus is the other dimension. Now, a trick with these is if you can identify what are the key driving forces in the industry, then they're likely to make good axes for your strategic groups. Pretty self-evident. So if you're able to identify technology, geographical coverage, a few things like that as key forces, they're likely to make good axes for your strategic group map, so you want to start with them. Okay, so you can see then what's happening is that the companies, instead of being uniformly distributed, they will end up in little groups, and we can, by looking at them either in their physical layout or alternatively by considering the companies in that region and saying, oh yeah, they all look very similar, then you can create these clusters and you can allocate, for example, a market share to them and say, yep, this cluster is 10% of the market share, this cluster is only 2% of the market share. So although there's a lot of companies in that bottom low overseas focus, low R&D intensity category, they're not really getting good returns there, so that's not a group we want to look at. The group that's getting the best return on their sales is the ones playing the emergent markets with a big overseas focus and a lot of R&D. But that's also probably a high risk scenario. So you might say, well, yeah, okay, it's very profitable, but they're also taking a big risk, maybe too much. What about the explorers or the outsourcers? And you have a look at those. And so the purpose of this is to identify from others, groups of other organisations, what are viable strategic positions to take in the market. And looking at their overall performance, you can work out, is that attractive, and would you want to do that in your organisation? Okay, so helps you understand the competition, identify your opportunities, and work out. And the other thing is, it can be quite difficult to move from these markets. So if you're an exploiter, for example, and you said, oh, look, we're not making any return, we want to become outsourcers. Well, the whole problem with that is that the organisation has been geared up to basically produce generic drugs for local markets. So it's quite competitive, there's not much of a margin, but they've got a big factory and they make paracetamol and they do a couple of vitamins and that's it. So to be outsourcers, to say, right, we're now going to get our paracetamol made in China and we're going to distribute it in lots and lots of different countries from China, means that we've got to shut down our factory, we've got to sell all our equipment, we've got to find some suppliers in China, we've got to set up some new distribution networks. Hey, that's really difficult. We don't even have any idea how to do that. We've just had this little factory that we've owned for 100 years on the outskirts of Melbourne, and we don't owe any money on it, and we don't really know, we don't go overseas. Or last time I was overseas was 10 years ago, and no one else in the company's been overseas for a long time, and we don't have any connections, and our supply chains are very local. We don't have any international supply chains. That would be really difficult for us to do. So although it's more attractive, we don't really know how. So we're locked in by virtue of our knowledge, our connections, our capabilities and our infrastructure, and it's quite difficult for us to jump to a different segment of the market, even though you might say they're all in the same industry. They're all drug manufacturers, right? Not really when you look at how they compete in the market. Okay, market segments, niches. We tend to have two niches of interest from the strategic perspective, or two types of market segments. One is broad market segments, and that's what the supermarkets tend to focus on. Everyone should go to a supermarket, is what the supermarket industry thinks. So they have products there for everyone. They have expensive products and they have cheap products. They've got stuff on sale, low quality, high quality. They've got everything for everyone. And as a result, they'll carry 30,000 products, which is a lot. But we might service a niche. The most niche shop I have ever seen is one in Sydney which sells left-handed products. So it sells a range of products for people who are left-handed. They've got left-handed scissors, left-handed combs, and a whole range of things like that. Obviously, some of them are jokes, but it's a left-handed shop. It's quite successful. It's been there for a while. It's obviously very small, quite a market niche for those people who actually want to buy left-handed products. So those are the two categories. One means you have to be, you're differentiated on the basis of something for everyone. The other, the very narrow niche, means that your product and your service and what you offer has to be extremely focused, and you have to operate a very different business, a different scale. When you're providing for everyone, it's a large business. When you're providing a narrow range of things, then it's usually a very small business. So that's our major concern. So market segmentation can be on the basis of age, location, lifestyle, spending power, frequency of purchasing, a whole range of things like that. Strategic customers are powerful buyers who form a significant component of your overall sales. And you need to know who they are, because they will define the nature of how you compete. So if you've got a big customer and the customer says, we're going down lower cost, higher volume, then that's what you have to do, because that's a major component of your sales. Critical success factors. These are really important. Similar numbers to industry forces. You want about 6. You don't want 20 and you don't want 2. If there's only 2 things that are critical to making your organisation successful, then you have to worry, because that's pretty easy to copy. If there's 6 things, that's quite a lot to copy. If there's 20 things, then that's too much to perform in. So if you've got around 5 to 10 things, that's a good number. It's not easy to get all of that in place, but it's doable. And so if you're already there, then you focus on doing that. So the critical success factors are a very broad scale description of what provides your competitive advantage. So if you're that drug company who's innovative and global that we looked at, who had a good return on sales, one of the critical success factors is to be able to introduce new products, bring it to market quickly, and distribute globally. That's actually probably 3, I guess, really. Key success factors will vary by industry and industry segment. They are not, however, conditions of your organisation, and that's the number one mistake I see people making. The company's key success factors are they're very good at marketing. Absolutely not. It may be that the key success factor for the segment of the industry is the ability to get the message out to the customers. So that could be the case, but the key success factor is never a description of the organisation. It's a description of what it takes to be successful in that segment of the industry. And it's the end result of the environmental analysis. Then the next stage of strategy is to think about how we build up the capability to do that, to be particularly successful in our segment of the industry. So I've written that line there. Don't get confused. Each organisation should know its key success factors, should know its industry's key success factors, and maintain its capability of meeting those. So it's slightly deceptive sentence. The key success factors are a description of the external environment, not a description of the company. Because we need that objectivity. We need to say, this is the world in which we inhabit, and it defines how we should compete. We can move to a different world, that's fine, but if we choose to stay here because we think it's not a bad place to compete, then that defines what we need to do, and then we go about working about how we're going to do it. And every company can have a different way of becoming competitive and responding to those conditions, but you have to have the objective statement, first of all, that that's what you do. And so many companies make the mistake of saying, we're really good at doing this thing, so therefore we're going to be successful. We're really good at introducing crazy new products. So we're going to go to China with all our crazy new products. They've done quite a bit of research in this area. And funnily enough, the market doesn't want those things. And they say, but we've got these great new ideas and we're changing them all the time and we can do all sorts. They don't want that. They want more proven, reliable, dependable products for a whole range of reasons. So just because you do it well doesn't mean you're going to be successful. You've got to do the right things well, and the only way to be correctly focused is to start off with the objective assessment of what it is you need to do well, and then go to the next stage of working out what you should do well to achieve that. And that usually means giving up on some stuff that you used to do really well, but no one really wants anymore, and introducing some stuff that you don't really know how to do just yet, but, well, if you're going to stay in that industry, you've got to do it. Yes, only. Yes, or the segment. The segment of the industry the company operates in, more likely.
Yeah, but if we try to map some of those CSF on our company, like, okay, these are the
Well, that's the next stage. Yep, absolutely. That's next week. This week, we're only going as far as saying these are the critical success factors. And if your company cannot perform in those areas, it's not going to be successful. That's the statement we need to make. So if you're brought into an organisation as a consultant and say, our sales are constantly diminishing, you say, well, little wonder. The key success factors in this industry are flexibility, quality, geographical coverage, and 2 or 3 other things. And you've got no flexibility, and your quality has been diminishing over the last few years. You're failing to meet 2 of the important key success factors, so you're not going to be successful. That's why. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on quality and whatever it was, geographical coverage, and we're going to improve your ability to perform in that area by building new strengths, new capabilities, and then you'll be more successful. So that's why we're doing it. And then the company might say, oh, but we've got this, this and that, and, we do these other things well. And you say, well, that's fine, but they don't lead to competitiveness in this industry. They're not key success factors. So you're investing your important resources in capabilities that don't provide competition. So, and this is the environment organisations are constantly in, that they keep having to retire old capabilities and introduce new ones as the world changes. But all of their management systems, all the control systems are designed to maintain those capabilities. Right? So if you've got very capable staff who are able to do lots of product development, then you've got training and you've got HR reward systems and you've got pleasant work environments and all sorts of things designed to increase creativity and capability. But if one of the key success factors is that you've got to have low-cost design and you said, right, well, we're going to have to outsource our design, then all of your management systems are going to fight against that because they're all about maintaining a design capability and getting people being creative. But that was 10 years ago. Now you have to outsource your design. You have to move it out to the supply chain. You don't want people being creative anymore. You want people being focused and cost controlling and efficient because you've outsourced the creative, but you don't do it in-house anymore. So you've got to change your culture. You've got to change your management systems, everything to enable you to do it, because it's going to keep trying to bring creativity back in, because that's how you design the organisation. So it's a big deal to follow the key critical success factors and make sure you have the capabilities there. And that's why you have to be so objective, because a company